people of Reddit. What events in history are taught completely wrong in your education system? NSFW BC history can be dark. Japanese here. I lived with international students from China and Korea for 5 years. We compared each other's textbooks, and man, the comprehension of history swings wildly, from ancient China to WW to era Japan to modern Korea. I think there are different narratives how Germany conquered Austria. The troubles, not wrong, but neglected to be taught at all, at least at my school here in England. Unless maybe I just missed it. Not exactly history class, but my Indonesian friend told me a funny story when he went to Netherlands and visited one of the museums there. Most of their Indonesian national heroes who fought against the Netherlands was displayed in the museum, but were labeled traitors or something along those lines. Are we the baddies? Maybe not wrong, but glossed over. But I feel like in history in the US, we are taught a lot about the atrocities of Germany in WW2, but they never seem to bring up Japan and the horrors that took place there. In the Netherlands, it's about the War of Independence in Indonesia. It is the most brutal war the Netherlands fought in, and the history books here mention it like it was just an uproar. Since the 70s, people here tried to protest that the war was wrongly documented. However, to no affair, the books were not changed. Did an enormous research on the war, and they found that the Netherlands committed great atrocities in their former colony during the war, and the war was absolutely brutal and devastating on both sides. People are pushing to change the books again, but for some reason the people that write and supply the books are hesitant to change it because some of the soldiers who fought in that war are still alive. So the history teachers here have the duty of telling the students the truth even though the book says differently. Storytime. German academic here. I had an Indian intern student, first time in Europe. He had a great time traveling around Europe on weekends, and one Monday morning asked me, so France is full of statues of their kings, Austria too, Italy as well. Why have I not seen a single Hitler statue in Germany? Ed in school about Hitler, and it turns out that the portrayal had been along the lines of a great statesman, did a lot for Germany, eventually started a war and lost, not unlike a German Napoleon. I'm wondering how much of that is anti-British sentiment. Belgium. Nothing bad happened in Africa according to our books. The US labor movement, what they fought for, why, and what gov corporations did to try to not pay people a reasonable wage, or have days off, or not turn children into indentured servants. Seems like we're trying to get back to that though. At least when I was in elementary school, it was always heavily implied that Native Americans welcomed us with open arms and then vanished. We'd learn about settlers, but it was like they were going through empty country and finding places no one had ever been. Wasn't until I was older that I realized they just kind of left out a lot of conflict. In the USA, we never learn about the Banana Wars and US occupations of countries like Haiti, Philippines, Cuba, etc. I think because those wars are impossible to portray as good. When the US Marines murdered innocent people and let American corporations control the economies of nations in the global South. I highly recommend reading the book Gangsters of Capitalism by Jonathan M. Katz. I learned about the Tulsa Massacre from a superhero show on HBO. In the US, I was only told the 20s was this cool time with jazz and prohibition. Nothing about the various countries we were occupying to kill rebels for the sake of corporate profits, or the Battle of Blair Mountain, the second largest armed revolt in US history. Hey ha, well boy, said the Bangladeshi. I live in the south of the US. Our teachers actively taught us that the Civil Wars wasn't a slavery issue, but a states' right issue. They'll get all wonky if you challenge that. That's only true by a technicality. The only right they had an issue with was slavery. American here. Pilgrims land in 1620, then suddenly it is 150 years later, 1776. I grew up in New England, and it wasn't until I was in my 30s I wondered about what happened in between. And then I found out why you don't want to teach that to children. The Algerian War of Independence. Back when I was in high school, it was the very first year that this topic was taught in high school in an entire chapter. Before it was only mentioned briefly except that it completely downplayed what France did there, all the atrocities, torture, and more. It was seen from a neutral point of view and barely indicated that France actually lost the war and did not simply give Algeria its independence. I had to wait until I was in college to find the few French movies that talked about this war and described how awful we acted there and what we truly did. Even today, it's barely talked about that we committed such atrocities, and not only in Algeria, but in our own country against the very same people. In 1961, a protest against an anti-Muslim curfew resulted in around 100 Algerians being drowned in the Seine by the police. And that's far from the only thing that happened. Some people that actively participated in this war are still alive today, and we barely talk about it. Except for the Algerians and/or activists, which are very vocal about it but are silenced. Truly one of the worst things France has ever done. We often talk about Spain, the Netherlands, or the UK as important colonialist countries, but France also had a huge part in it that it often downplays. What we're forgetting here is that a lot of history isn't taught wrong, it's just skipped over or oversimplified. Everything, everywhere in the Middle East. Not sure if it's still the case, but when I was at school we were taught that the famine in Ireland was caused by the potato blight, not the English taking all the food for themselves. Manifest Destiny left out the genocide part until college courses. Edit apparently people struggle with the idea that things change in schools over the years. So when I was at school, EDIT. In the UK, the only discussion of slavery was when looking at America. Very little mention of the UK's involvement and basically nothing about our empire building. John Brown. There isn't really a context in which his story makes him a traitor unless you leave out all the facts. Anyone who looked around and saw Americans in chains and tried to arm them to free themselves is not an American. That's for sure. Slavery in the United States was far more vicious and bloodthirsty than it's ever discussed. There was a fiendish amount of rape, impregnation, and horrifying perversion going on. Slaves worked to death rather than supply them with food or water when they were working in remote fields or other locations. Arbitrary murder, ambitious torture was common just to prove who was in charge. All these things are very well documented, and in fact there were even interviews with ex-slaves that have been recorded describing these incidents. As something like what happened in Gone with the Wind, and we think people like Thomas Jefferson were so wonderful when he raped slaves and impregnated him and laughed about it and never freed them. The massive drug use by the Nazis in World War to soldiers and leadership. Few seem to realize how the initial military gains were basically fueled by meth, but over time the effects of addiction caught up with both the military performance and decision-making. I honestly don't know why it isn't taught in primary school. It would make for a pretty good anti-drug campaign. Kasinga Massacre in Namibia. It was an air raid on a SWAPO military camp by the South African Defense Force. 165 men, 290 for women, and 300 children died during the raid. It's taught as if the SADF just decided to kill a bunch of innocent women and children. However, what they failed to mention is that SADF warned SWAPO of the raid. They gave them the exact date and time of the raid and told them to please vacate the area as it will be leveled with the ground. The response from SWAPO was to invite all the women and children from neighboring villages to come and stay on the base with them, with the thought that hiding behind women and children will keep them safe. SADF delivered the air raid exactly on the date and time as they warned them they would. At least we have a public holiday now. Thanks for watching.